Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on from where in the world you're joining us for this conference. My name is Jane McAdam, and I'm the Director of the Andrew and Renata Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Let me begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, which in my case are the Darramurrugal people, and let me extend my acknowledgement to elders past, present and emerging, and of course any Torres Strait and Aboriginal peoples who are with us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2021 Kaldor Centre Conference, which explores mobility in the context of climate change and disasters. Forced migration is one of the biggest global challenges of our time. And as contemporary crises interlock and compound, more people are likely to be trapped or displaced by the impacts of poverty, conflict, pandemics, disasters, and climate change. Widening inequality, discrimination, and limits on movement, especially during the pandemic, have highlighted the challenges of mobility and immobility alike. The Kaldor Centre is dedicated to undertaking rigorous research on the most pressing displacement issues in Australia, the Asia-Pacific region, and the world. And we seek to contribute to public policy by promoting legal, sustainable, and humane solutions to forced migration. Our research in the area of climate-related movement has been at the forefront of legal debates and policy developments, and we're delighted that this week we can bring so many experts together to discuss these issues further. I would particularly like to acknowledge our premier sponsor for the conference, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, as well as our sponsor for the opening panel, Slater and Gordon. We thank you for your support for this session and for the conference overall. The impacts of climate change are already prompting people to move. Last year, 31 million people were displaced within their own countries by disasters. That's 3 times as many people as by conflict. Other people are moving in anticipation of the longer-term impacts of disasters and climate change, including through planned relocations to safer areas. Now, most of this movement is internal, that is within countries, but some of it is across borders, often intersecting with other drivers of movement like conflict, as well as exacerbating existing discrimination and marginalisation. As we look towards next month's UN climate talks in Glasgow at COP26, today's panel of experts will discuss what our political leaders, our policymakers, and communities in general need to know about human mobility and climate change, so as to create meaningful and sustainable solutions. I'd now like to introduce our 4 panelists this morning. Ambassador Rabab Fatima is Bangladesh's permanent representative to the United Nations. As a career diplomat, she's previously served in various Bangladesh missions, including in Calcutta, Geneva, and Beijing. And she's served with the International Organization for Migration as the regional representative for South Asia, and also as the regional advisor for South and Southwest Asia and regional advisor for climate change and migration in IOM's regional office for Asia and the Pacific. Andrew Harper is the Special Advisor on Climate Action to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. There he is responsible for providing strategic guidance, oversight and expertise to shape UNHCR's response to the climate emergency. He's previously served in a variety of other roles for UNHCR, including leading and coordinating the international response to the Syrian crisis in Jordan. Francis Namoumou is the ecumenical animator for the Ecological Stewardship and Climate Justice Program at the Pacific Conference of Churches. Since 2016, most of her work has focused on support to communities relocated in the context of climate change. She has a keen interest in climate justice and disaster management in the context of Pacific resilience. Nicole Shepardson is Policy Team Leader and Senior Protection Policy Officer in the United States State Department Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration. Nicole and her team formulate humanitarian policy for the US on issues affecting refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless persons, and vulnerable migrants. Among her previous roles, she worked on US emergency responses to humanitarian crises in Haiti, Iraq, Lebanon, Liberia, and Libya, including temporary deployments to Jordan and Tunisia. So an enormous welcome to our panelists, and for the audience, I just wanted to explain what the format of the session will be. We're going to have around 40 minutes of a moderated discussion, followed by 15 minutes of audience Q&A. You are very welcome and encouraged to post your questions through the Q&A function at any time, which you'll find on your screen. So to begin, Andrew, can you explain how climate change is affecting human mobility today? What are the core issues that policymakers, politicians, and the general public need to understand?
Okay, thanks, Jane, and thanks to the Kaldor Centre for hosting us today, and hello to all our friends there. Very relevant question. I've just got back from Mauritania yesterday, where we're looking at exactly this: how climate change is interacting with other key drivers for and basically causing disruption of society. And I think what we're already seeing is that 90% of refugees under UNHCR's mandate and 70% of IDPs around the world originating from countries most vulnerable to the climate emergency. So it's already happening. There is this interaction and nexus between climate exacerbating underlying grievances, and I think that's probably one of the key elements we need to take into account. Climate change, conflict, poverty, food insecurity, and displacement are increasingly overlapping, and this is driving more people from their homes in search of safety and security. The ability to attribute the key reason why anyone leaves is increasingly challenging, and this is why it's so important that more research and evidence goes into the discussions. Taking into account that mobility, we also need to note that most people displaced by disasters remain within their home countries. It's only generally when there's compounding disasters or a lack of capacity to respond to their needs do people start seeking safety across borders. And at that point, they may need international protection. So climate change related disasters cannot, and they should not be looked at in isolation as separate phenomena. Their effects, whether slow or fast, they really act as vulnerability multipliers. And I like to stress the vulnerability multiplier than what people often say is a threat multiplier, because people should not be seen as a threat. People do not generally wish to leave if there's any way in which they can stay. So what we need to be looking at is how do we enhance resilience and adaptation before people are forced to go. The question that we always receive is the term climate refugee. And like, climate refugees have no legal basis, and and my panelists probably know this very well, but I'll say it again. A refugee is defined as somebody who's crossed an international border owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. This is very legalistic, but it's worth saying. Well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership, or of a particular social group or political opinion. That's under the 951 Convention. In some contexts, however, including in relation to the 1969 Organisation African Union Convention and the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, where there are events seriously disturbing public order, such as in a disaster situation, there may be an extension of the refugee criteria in those contexts. And so they're the elements which we need to take into account. But I will be happy to keep it under 3 minutes. And so I'll finish now. Over.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And thanks for, I really like the way you explained there that it's a vulnerability multiplier. I think that's a very useful way to be thinking about the impacts of climate change on populations. Nicole, if I can turn to you, this year you led the US State Department's input into a report commissioned by President Biden, which was looking at how the US should plan for the impact of climate change on migration and displacement. And that report's due out imminently. We'd hoped it might be out by now, but to the extent you can, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, what prompted that report.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you very much to the Kaldor Centre for including me in this discussion. You know, from day one, President Biden has made addressing the climate crisis a top priority for the United States and a core element of US foreign policy. We are taking into account how every bilateral and multilateral engagement we have, every policy decision we make will impact our goal of putting the world on a safer and more sustainable path. So displacement and migration are significantly impacted by climate change, and these issues merit serious attention to develop policies and laws that can help prevent and mitigate devastating loss of life and human suffering. On February 4th, President Biden issued an executive order on rebuilding and enhancing programs to resettle refugees and planning for the impact of climate change on migration. And that executive order called for a US interagency report, as you mentioned, on climate change and its impact on migration, including forced migration, internal displacement, and planned relocation. So the report's development has been a whole of government process coordinated by the National Security Council at the White House. The report is divided into 4 sections: international security implications, protection and resettlement considerations, foreign assistance, and multilateral engagement. My bureau in the State Department, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, led an interagency working group on the protection and resettlement considerations that included members of the National Security Council, the State Department, USAID, the Departments of Interior, Homeland Security, and NASA, among other agencies. So it was quite a whole of government approach just on the issue of protection and resettlement. And within that effort, we conducted a series of consultations with external stakeholders, some of whom are a part of this conference, which is great, including international organization partners, civil society groups, academics, think tanks, and others. So it was a very comprehensive and insightful process that meant a lot to us in the US government putting this report together.
It sounds like an enormous number of organizations and people to coordinate and you know, quite a diverse range. And I wondered, you know, you were tasked to look at the impacts of climate change on displacement, including internal displacement, migration, and planned relocation. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, well, you know, what each of these means, but what you had to consider in relation to them, please.
Sure, yes. So when we started on this, you know, we were embarking with 2 pieces of knowledge that we had already that were informed by previous work on the intersection of climate change and migration. First, we know that climate change is rarely, if ever, a singular factor in individuals' migration decisions, as Andrew mentioned. Most often, climate change is one of several reasons why a person is compelled to flee their home or decides to leave voluntarily. And we were looking at both the forced displacement and voluntary migration. And second, we know, as Andrew mentioned also, that the term climate refugees is problematic because it implies that displacement is a result of climate change as a basis for international protection under the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 67 protocol, which it is not. So we wanted to be clear about those things. But one of our first tasks in preparing the report to the president was to define our terminology. And we had to be careful in what kind of terms we were using. We've been using terms like climate-related displacement and climate change-related migration. We needed to consider both slow onset as well as rapid onset climate events and their impacts on forced and voluntary movement. So, you know, as Andrew mentioned, the data is showing us already that the intersection of climate change, conflict, and disasters is accelerating displacement to unprecedented levels, and we should expect this trend to continue. While the vast majority of displacement related to climate change is occurring within countries' own borders, there are substantial gaps in the international framework's domestic implementation and multilateral operations to protect internally displaced persons. And so we talked about how we might improve that. The UN Secretary General recently issued a report by a high-level panel on internal displacement that discusses the impacts of climate change and emphasizes inclusion of IDPs in development solutions. But the international community and host governments still have a lot of work to do to strengthen protection of IDPs. In considering cross-border displacement to related to climate change, the consultations that the US government conducted with external stakeholders included an important recognition that we need to use the protection frameworks that we have as they may apply. For example, we can apply the Refugee Convention definition to protect individuals if a government denies or withholds from them relief from the impacts of climate change on the basis of a protected characteristic in ways that might amount to persecution. Or we can use the convention definition, for example, to protect individuals persecuted for their climate activism. We can work with UNHCR to incorporate discussions on climate considerations for third country refugee resettlement. And we can encourage states who subscribe to the OAU Refugee Convention, as Andrew mentioned, or the Cartagena Declaration, to better protect those fleeing the impacts of climate change that amount to events seriously disturbing public order. So we have all of these tools at our disposal that we should be using. In the United States, we have the tool of the Temporary Protected Status Authority that we can consider expanding how we use that authority to improve protection from removal to countries suffering environmental disasters related to climate change. So all these existing instruments to protect displaced individuals in the context of climate change are useful but limited in scope. And given the growing displacement trends, it's very important to expand access to protection. It's vital, really. And so in addition to using the existing frameworks, we need to consider ways to supplement the current protection regime with new complementary legal pathways. Over.
Thanks, Nicole. That's very encouraging to hear, particularly from a country like the United States, which historically has been so strong on refugee protection and resettlement, particularly historically leading the way on resettlement. Rabab, if I could turn to you now, your involvement with these issues goes back a long way. And when we first met in Dhaka in 2010, you were heading up IOM's regional office and had just overseen the publication of an excellent report examining the nexus of environment, climate change and migration in Bangladesh. As you noted in that report, although Bangladesh is highly exposed to sudden onset extreme weather events like cyclones and floods, as well as slow onset processes like changing rainfall patterns and saltwater intrusion, Bangladesh, and I quote, Bangladesh is in a position to respond proactively to minimise the risks and maximise the benefits of environmental migration and has many good practices to share. So I wondered, what are some of these practices from which other countries could learn? And potentially, are there even more good practices in the intervening decade?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane, for your kind words. And I thank you also for inviting me. This discussion so far has been extremely good. And excellent presentations also from the previous speakers. Indeed, Jane, my involvement with this debate is for more than a decade now, both due to my association with the government of Bangladesh, as well as during my time with IOM. And the IPCC's 2007 assessment report was one of the first intergovernmental reports to put a sharp spotlight on climate-induced displacement. And that sort of triggered and encouraged many more empirical research on this topic. And then we have seen its integration in the 2030 agenda in Paris and other intergovernmental organizations. The nexus of environment, climate change, and human displacement is now fairly well recognized. Yet we seriously lag behind in translating our shared political commitments into actionable agendas on the ground. We are still sort of struggling in finding an accepted definition, as the previous speakers mentioned about. And this is all happening even when we know that climate displacements, millions are actually being displaced because of weather-related hazards. According to IDMC, more than 98% of the more than 30 million new displacements that took place in 2020 was because of, as a result of weather-related displacements. And COVID-19 may have further exacerbated the situation, especially playing on the pre-existing vulnerabilities. As the head of the IOM's regional office in Dhaka, I was closely involved in the publication of a comprehensive report in 2010, as you mentioned, Jane, to facilitate precisely that, to have a multi-stakeholder engagement on this issue, because there was a clear lack of understanding on that. I also co-authored in 2014 an article on this topic, highlighting in particular the vulnerabilities of low-lying coastal and small island states. We made a strong pitch there for a normatic framework to address this issue. I remember when we were launching that paper, we also had a colleague from UNHCR there, and I asked how UNHCR is going to look into the gap that exists now in the refugee convention and the protocol, because this population is not covered there. And that gap still remains. And in that context, Nicole, we are keenly looking forward to the report commissioned by President Biden, because I think you mentioned there that we are even going to look into definitional issues there. Coming back to the first publication, our efforts then, given the lack of understanding and skepticism, was to help the government to take an evidence-based and informed position on this phenomenon which is happening. Eventually, Bangladesh will take a leading role to shape this debate globally. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, my Prime Minister, was among one of the first global leaders to raise this issue with a sense of urgency in the UN General Assembly. In September 2009, she called upon world leaders to consider adopting a legal regime under the UNFCCC for tackling this problem. And it is from that principal position that Bangladesh supported the creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage and the Nansen Initiative as well. And you are right, Jane, as a climate vulnerable country where climate displacement is real, Bangladesh has important experience, ideas, and expertise with other countries facing similar challenges. Let me share two specific thoughts in this regard. First, as the current president of the 48-member Climate Vulnerability Forum, my Prime Minister announced the Mujib Climate Resilient Prosperity Plan Decade 2030. From a position of, this is a shift in our approach to addressing this problem. From a position of vulnerability, this plan actually aims to build resilience and capacity, and eventually that would lead to prosperity. So moving away essentially from a victim-centric approach to a proactive and contributory approach, a vision under which we will strive to enhance resilience, grow our economy, create jobs, and expand opportunities using climate action on climate change as a catalyst. So this is quite a transformative sort of agenda and plan that we have. And we are encouraging and supporting other climate vulnerable forum countries to develop their own prosperity plans. We can do this on our own, but international climate financing will certainly speed things along. Secondly, Bangladesh has developed one of the most effective locally led early warning systems and evacuation program to tackle sudden onset events such as floods, cyclones, and river erosion. Even during this pandemic, we proved our resilience in tackling the super cyclone Amphan. And we have launched a comprehensive 82-year Delta Plan 2100 to adapt to the slow onset of climate change, because this is something which is happening in my country already. We are investing in rehabilitation projects and risk-informed investment in adaptation and resilience building and so on. We are ready to share our experience living in the largest delta of the world and tackling both current and future challenges with other vulnerable countries. To sum it up, Jane, our approach has always been to minimize the risks at the source. And this is, I believe, what I told you back in 2010 also. And we have important lessons and experiences to share in this regard. In seeking locally led solutions, which includes, among others, creating opportunities for alternative sustainable livelihoods with a view to prevent or minimize population displacement. Because if there's unplanned, erratic population displacement, that is going to create even more problem in the new area where the people are going to go. So because we have a huge population, the idea is to see how we can actually minimize the risk to, in the first place, to prevent population displacement. It's not easy, but we have good experience. I think we have been able to put to rest some of the very dire predictions that were there regarding very erratic population displacement that will be taking place in Bangladesh. Thank you. I think I'll rest it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabab. And I think perhaps if you could just answer this in a quick sentence, if that's possible, before we turn to some of those local initiatives on the ground with Francis. Do you feel that Bangladesh's perspective is being heard now and being followed in international fora?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jane. It's not going to be very short answer because I think I have some information to share, and I think it's important for you to know. Like I said, this has been very much high on the agenda. Prime Minister brought it to the UN General Assembly, asked for a legal regime. I know Andrew is looking at me, but asking for a legal regime to ensure the social, cultural, and economic rehabilitation of environmental degradation and climate change. So that was done. In keeping with this position, we placed climate change high on our domestic and foreign policy agendas. As a leading global voice on climate change, we push for the inclusion of this issue in all major UN frameworks, agendas, and compacts. We joined other partners to ensure its place in the 2030 agenda and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And I believe our deep engagement, and this is, I think, where it was heard, our deep engagement with all stakeholders facilitated the recognition of this phenomenon by the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And most recently, last week, we actively contributed to the creation of a mandate, a new mandate in the Human Rights Council, a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. So we are continuing our efforts. Having said that, we recognize that much more still remains to be done to reach global common understanding and agreement on this issue, both from the political and legal perspectives. Besides, and I think this is very important for I think the others to listen to, besides the formal track of discussions and debates, we have also been active in other informal platforms, which are now quite the vogue here in the UN, to raise awareness and understanding on this subject. In New York, for instance, we have been active members of the Group of Friends on Climate Change. So there is a Group of Friends on Climate Change, Group of Friends on Migration. So all these topics do come up there. Group of Friends on Climate Change and Security, Group of Friends on DRR. And these friends groups have been playing an important role. These are all member states sitting there essentially in addressing the different dimensions of climate change and in turn trying to find a way to find consensus and programmatic interventions. In Geneva, for instance, we are active in the Group of Friends on PDD. Okay, there is certainly much more to be done as climate-induced displacements continue to remain alarmingly high. The upcoming COP26, we believe, will be a good opportunity to revisit this issue and try to reach a clear understanding and consensus. And I think both the previous speakers actually referred to that. And I think it's very, very important to have a clear understanding and consensus, because if we are to have a coherent, effective and collaborative mechanism. And this will be high on Bangladesh's agenda also at COP22. Can I just highlight two priorities, Jane, in this regard? First, we will continue for Bangladesh, we'll continue to invest in efforts to create necessary political willingness and momentum to address this issue adequately in the context of multilateral cooperation. And secondly, we will continue to highlight the need for adequate resources and technology support from the major economies. And I think that will be very important if you have to take preventive actions, especially from G7, G20 for the countries most affected by this phenomenon. My Prime Minister took part in a high-level closed-door meeting on climate that was convened by the Secretary General and Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the sidelines on the first day, actually, before the high-level week in the GA. And these are many of the issues that we certainly raised, and we intend to take them also to COP26. Thank you. I'll rest it there.
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, Francis, if I can now turn to you, you're working directly with Pacific communities affected by the impacts of disasters, who are not only concerned with the here and now, but with the longer term consequences of climate change, including their ability to remain in their homes. So I wondered, in your advocacy, how do you frame the issues so that decision makers do sit up and take notice, while also being sensitive to the concerns and suggestions of those on the ground?
Thank you, Jane. And thank you to all the previous presenters in the context that they've shared, as it reflects or very important to the engagement of communities. Our realities in the Pacific, I would say, is frames our advocacy and messaging, which is shared from communities through different platforms, but also reaches the decision-making level. And I would like to share in this space that there are two specific contexts that are often core of our advocacy or messaging. One is the survival of our people, and the second is the ability to continue living on the land of our ancestors. I think these are really two core messaging that often comes in our advocacy works, because it brings out the urgency of the issue and prompts our demands for commitments and actions from everyone: the government, civil society organization, private sectors, communities of faith, women, children, persons living with disability as well. Now, as Andrew had mentioned earlier, here in the Pacific, climate change is not a standalone issue. It's linked and exacerbates impacts on other issues like food security, health, disasters, climate-induced relocation or displacement. Even organizations are already forecasting conflicts because people will have to move and due to land issues. And so all this encompasses this context or the framing of survival. If we were to take the second point I raised earlier, and the ability to continue living on the land that our ancestors had given us, you want to understand not only from the Pacific, but also indigenous communities, the connections we have, with our environment, our relational, indigenous relational with our environment. This is probably where most of our Pacific CSOs or advocacy messaging is often focused around non-economic loss and damage. How do you put a value to our identity or culture and tradition when we lose this? And when we're thinking about migrating or relocating, how are these contexts or concepts addressed in the relocation planning? So this pushes us, I guess, the awareness of survival and the ability to live on the land that has been given to us by ancestors, very key to our advocacy, because it pulls all our awareness and advocacy together, specific communities. If a padre, a pastor often says, who's from Tuvalu, if Tuvalu sings, the world will sink afterwards. If we save Tuvalu, we'll save the rest of the world. So that's probably where the framing of our advocacy and messaging is often come from.
And thanks, Frances. I mean, how much do international discussions at the UN matter in terms of your advocacy, and how have past experiences at COP meetings affected your strategy?
Discussions at the UN and COP meetings are just as important as national and regional meetings. I think they play a very key part to our work plan or our annual events. I guess these are important because the platforms, an opportunity for the Pacific communities or region to share our realities, our stories and advocacy from our communities, but at the same time, listen and learn from other communities and actions happening in other regions, share best practices and solutions. And this shared spaces, reflects our global effort, to change our lifestyle, from one that is looking at development more at the expense of our environment, to one that recognizes the importance of our stewardship role or custodians to Mother Planet. Another issue is, because we're talking about Pacific people attending COP meetings or UN meetings, getting Pacific people across to these meetings, at the time zone difference and the cost of traveling across. And we also know that the limitation of people that we can take across to attend this meeting, to cover different sessions. I think this is where the collaboration of Pacific Island countries, the role of Pacific civil society organization and other networks attending this event is important, because we are able to support each other where and when we can, but at the same time amplify now different platforms, the demands from the Pacific. I would like to recall at the COP23, I'm not sure whether this happens often, when the different groups, the women, the youth, indigenous network, faith communities were to present their statements or position paper. It was late in the evening. We were speaking to more empty chairs than official delegations who need to hear the voices of the different representations. So I believe if the UN space or the COP space are serious about these talks, the gender must accommodate the voices of communities who will be represented in these spaces. Maybe the time, for these position papers or to be shared is very relevant, and it is important that the negotiators or our governments hear the voices of these people, because they are going to speak the realities from their different contexts that will shape, the overall policies or statements coming out, and actions to be taken coming out from these different meetings.
Thanks, Frances. I think those are extremely important points, and I think on the one hand, working virtually might have been able to address some of those issues about cost and distance. And yet on the other hand, we know that virtual ways of working bring their own challenges and problems. We've got another round of questions, but I'm also very mindful of the time. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists to keep their answers short. And to the extent I can, I will try and integrate some questions that we've received through the Q&A function. Andrew, if I can go back to you, could you just tell us what UNHCR is doing on the ground or operationally when it comes to people who are at risk of or already displaced in these circumstances?
No, thanks. It's sort of the response can sort of be helped by what everyone else has been saying, and I think also what Nicole had said was that the inclusion of IDPs in development activities or solutions is also super important, because people displaced by disasters are internally displaced first inside the country, and so and what we're seeing across the world is that there's a lack of emphasis or a lack of value given to peaceful coexistence. And what is happening is people I think are looking at the wrong things. They're looking at reacting to events rather than seeing how we can better anticipate. So again, I just came back from looking at the situation on the Mali-Mauritanian border. We're having obviously huge population movements within the Sahel, but a lot of those population movements are difficult to attribute specifically to one area. And I'll just give you an example rather than sort of going into too much about what UNHCR is doing. UNHCR is doing a lot. We got hundreds of officers, all hundreds of countries, but I think it's more important to focus on the human element there. There was a population of fisher folk who were in Mali, and they were surviving on a lake. The lake dried up. They moved to another lake in Mali. It dried up. They moved to another area where they were chased out by jihadists. They moved to the border with Mauritania, but they couldn't survive in the border, and they had to cross the border into Mauritania. So then they've moved into a lake area, a swamp area where they're fishing, but now they're in conflict with local herders. So this is the dynamics that is crossing. Like, nothing is simple anymore. These people would traditionally move across the region because of that's how they lived. Like, mobility was their life. But in many places, that mobility and sense of how life was in the past has been jeopardized. And so having the voices of people to explain what's going on is super important. This is why it's so important to have Frances and the ambassador talking about the actual situation on the ground. So we are adapting. We've got tens of millions of refugees, but if we don't be more proactive in addressing the root causes and being much more sophisticated in understanding the dynamics of why people are moving, then we're always going to be reacting. And we can't do that. We have to be addressing the vulnerability at the root. Over.
Thanks, Andrew. Look, just a quick question that came through on the chat, and I just wonder if you might have a response. The UN Human Rights Council earlier this month recognised access to a healthy and sustainable environment as a universal right. I mean, do you think that's going to have any implications for what we're discussing today?
Well, not immediately, but it will have may influence national adjudication decisions, and so that could have an impact on case law as we move forward, as you know this better than what I do. So in many aspects, when you start looking at international refugee law, that thing is not going to move. Like, that is there. But where you're likely to get much more flexibility in interpreting the rights of individuals impacted by climate change, and what we're not talking about enough is environmental degradation, then that's probably all national decisions, jurisprudence is likely to be much more flexible in deciding that. So that's where that will impact them in a much more, hopefully, progressive way.
Thanks. Nicole, if I could turn back to you now. As a national policymaker, you have to think carefully about what it means to implement solutions in practice. So can you speak briefly to the sorts of political or pragmatic considerations that you need to take into account when making recommendations to government? And, you know, are there gaps between what you feel that advocates or scholars may be asking for versus what you can deliver in practice?
Sure, thank you. So, you know, we have to recognize that migration is a form of adaptation. It's an essential response in some cases to climate threats, to livelihoods and well-being. And we need to manage it carefully so that it is safe, orderly, and humane. In terms of political and pragmatic considerations, I would just cite three very quickly. We should not be viewing increasing migration and displacement trends as a security threat. Andrew mentioned this earlier, but you know, there's discussion about climate change exacerbating resource scarcity that drives conflict and displacement. Empirical studies looking at this have failed to produce consistent evidence for a causal connection between migration and subsequent conflict. So really, we're not talking about migration becoming a cause of instability, but we see in many places xenophobia and inflammatory political rhetoric aggravating tensions. And so we want to try to avoid that or mitigate that. A second point is that, you know, we have to assure equity and inclusion in preparing and responding to climate change impacts on migration. These equity and inclusion are essential to effective policy and program development. We see the intersection of particular vulnerabilities exacerbated by displacement, such as gender-based violence, with vulnerabilities exacerbated by the impact of climate change, like indigenous land rights or lack of mobility for persons with disabilities. So we have to take these into account, and we have to consult affected communities, as Francis so graciously said. And then third, I would say that any consideration of new legal pathways to protection for individuals fleeing the impacts of climate change, it will need to take into account the broader immigration context. In our consultations with external stakeholders, the US government heard some advocates asking for a new climate-specific category for resettlement. And then we heard other advocates fearing that a new category for resettlement would take away precious resettlement slots from refugees under the convention definition who are in dire need of that solution. So we have to take a step back and look at the broader immigration context when we think about these issues.
And on that, Nicole, a question came in through the chat. How would temporary protected status in the US address the permanency of displacement in the context of climate change?
It's a great question. I think, you know, the statute as it's written in the United States does not do that right now. So right now, there is no pathway to a permanent legal status in the United States under the TPS authority. And I think that's a clear gap in terms of providing protection for those who will not be able to return because the impacts of climate change are permanent. And so that's something that would require a legislative fix. And in the meantime, we can think about other potential mechanisms. There are other immigration pathways that could be used in particular cases. So that's where we are with TPS, at least for the moment.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Rabab, if I could just turn back to you. In your current role at the UN in New York, how much does the displacement and migration angle feature in discussions? And also, how important are regional groupings of states or other strategic configurations in pushing for action on climate change and mobility?
Thank you, Jane. And my answer is not going to be too short. I'd like to reflect a little bit about what has been achieved a little bit on this subject already in the UN. For instance, you know, from the very beginning, you know, we have highlighted the need for finding a political consensus. That was very important, especially when you're in an intergovernmental process. We just heard both Nicole and Andrew highlight the definitional gaps or the legal gaps that still exist. So we have to find political consensus, also addressing the legal gap, also trying to establish the development nexus of climate-induced disasters. That includes climate displacement. And I believe our collaborative efforts with other partners culminated in the adoption of the Landscape Initiative Protection Agenda, which remains in 2015 by 109 countries. So that remains a sort of a pseudo protection framework for us in addressing this issue. And then for further advance the work of this initiative, we partnered with Germany in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit to launch the platform on disaster displacement. And I believe the PDD still remains a good example of effective partnership across regions, place climate migration issue high on the multilateral agenda. And very quickly, if I may say that we feel that the debate on climate-induced displacement is still evolving. I think it starts even in the context of finding an acceptable definition. If you put climate and migration, both two very divisive, politically sensitive issues in one sentence, I think immediately it becomes a non-starter at many points. But mention migration is sensitive as opposed to displacement. So, consequently, I think the legal gap also creates the protection gap. So these are the challenges that we face. But as I had mentioned, there are different forums besides the more formal intergovernmental processes where we have been trying to have dialogues and discourses to find an understanding and some common grounds on where we can work together. And Nicole mentioned another very important issue, and that is about migration should not be seen as a security threat. Sometimes there's a growing sort of discussion now on migration, climate security, how climate can be inducing, triggering displacement, and that is leading to security risks. And I think that over-securitization of the issue can also be a problematic area where we can find consensus, but this is also a very real issue in some regions. So this is going on. There is no common regional group position as such on the issue of climate and displacement. But as I said, we have been able to make some progress. This is increasingly being discussed. Even, climate and security is being discussed in the Security Council, or even in the peace-building commission's debates, and especially in the context of climate displacement, or even when we hear about the new mandate of the Human Rights Council on Climate Change and Human Rights. I'll just mention, and I think this will give you an idea about where things stand. Last Friday, we had an informal intergovernmental dialogue on this issue, more climate change in the humanitarian context, which was convened by the President of the General Assembly. And I will share two major takeaways from that meeting. And I think that will give you an idea about where things stand in the intergovernmental larger process. First, the debate on climate displacement encompasses multidimensional issues. And this includes pertaining to development, humanitarian, security, human rights, and legal domains. And there is also gaps in understanding among different actors within the UN system, as well as among member states on this subject. For instance, while humanitarian actors look into this issue with short-term perspectives, the development actors essentially have long-term views. And of course, there are competing sort of interests vis-a-vis resources and mandates. Then, of course, when the security actors come into play, they see it from the security lens, which can, again, like I said, potentially over-securitize the entire debate. And secondly, given, and this is, again, another takeaway from the debate, this was at a high level that we had last week, given the multidimensional aspect of this issue and the high political sensitivity, we would need an incremental evidence-based approach. And we need to have more such, multi-stakeholder dialogues, such as the one that we're even having now, to bring in more synergies among the different actors. But very, very important to bridge the gaps in our understanding, in trying to actually even find the common understanding on definition of the what we mean by that. So in the UN, this is an ongoing debate at different levels and with different dimensions. But I wouldn't say that we have yet a very common position on this matter. From a climate vulnerable country, our stakes are different. From another country, which is a source and a destination country or a developed country, which is giving the resources, I think there are different sort of views. And I think that differences also exist within the different UN agencies and players.
Thank you for that really comprehensive explanation, and I think it does, give us a good insight into some of the challenges that exist. Francis, if I can come back to you now, what do you feel that affected communities need to be able to, what do affected communities need to be able to do to retain their agency and make real choices about whether or not they want to stay or go?
To go or not to go? That is a very important question. I guess in our accompaniment work with the Pacific Conference of Churches, an important factor that we've continued to recognize is the sharing of the information to the communities. The discussion on relocation or may be sensitive, especially to when we are when the subject is about leaving their homes, but we feel we must still talk about this issue. It is very important to allow the spaces for communities to dialogue and find ways to move forward together or make a decision. And so, the free, prior, informed consent of communities, that they are making decisions, they are making informed decisions based on the knowledge that they're provided or based on the dialogue that they've had with the different stakeholders. And that has been one of the key findings from our accompaniment work with most of the communities or some of the communities that work with here in the region. But in talking about this, we've also realized that we cannot leave anyone behind. There are those in the communities that may choose not to go. And for our work, it is looking at ways that we continue to support those who choose to stay, and sustain, the environment that they choose to live in. There's been discussions around two aspects of what would a theology of hope in the church context would look like. A theology of hope for those relocating, and a theology of hospitality. How do receiving communities receive relocating communities? And in the same context of the theology of hope, how do we still provide hope to those who choose not to relocate? And given that the faith community is large here in the Pacific region, the Christian community, that has been one of the key challenges for us in accommodating the concerns or those who may choose not to stay, that their voices are also represented in the Talanoa, in the dialogue. But we've also, while moving into this work, I believe something like the planned relocation guideline that the Fiji government has put together, at least is a starting guide for the different stakeholders, the ministry, the government ministry, to come together and respond to this very sensitive and complex issue of moving. It guides our collective action. At the same time, we're learning and improving based on the different cases. But at the same time, as stated specifically in the Fiji planned relocation guideline, the community is centered. They must be informed of any, existing frameworks, guidelines and policies, and they are the drivers, or designers of the relocation processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, a question came through which I don't expect you to answer necessarily, but perhaps I can use it in kind of framing my final question to you, and also to indicate that a session this time tomorrow will look at this in more detail. And that was about Vanuatu's campaign seeking an advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice on human rights and climate change. And the question was, to what extent could climate-related mobility be raised in that? As I said, tomorrow this time somebody will be addressing that head on. But, you know, reflecting on that and on that campaign, Francis, just to conclude, you know, are there effective local strategies and practices that are making a difference already among Pacific communities?
Yes, there are. I think the movement of young people, women, and civil society organizations supporting our government in this work is one thing that has, you know, shifted the work in the region, shifted the focus for us to be more serious about this issue. But not only that, but what other method, what other avenue can we take this conversation to, so that our voices or our stories, realities from the Pacific region, not only the Pacific, but other vulnerable communities, are serious, you know, are being taken seriously and are validated in the conversation, in the political phases. One of the concepts, I believe, when the Fiji government, you know, took up the presidency of COP in 2017, introduced the Talanoa concept. I guess that concept is important for us because it's an ongoing space in the communities where you know, the different groups are coming together, men, women, children, young people. They are able to talk about the issue at you know, at present, and finding ways to provide solutions to this. The Tambu concept, you know, reviving Tambu practices where we are protecting breeding areas, where we are able to sustain whatever is left in our environment, whatever we can continue to breed during different seasons. And there are already projects in, you know, planting mangroves, not only in Fiji, but around the region, maybe other region as well, to protect their shorelines. Communities coming together, young people coming together to revive traditional knowledge, sustainable sea transportation, you know, using the traditional voyage, traditional canoes, so that we start to limit our carbon emission, even though we know we significantly emit, you know, insignificant amount of greenhouse gases. We still feel while we're at the forefront of this, the climate change, we still need to come up with ways that we can respond or adapt and mitigate the climate change issues. But at the same time, in terms of food security, how do we, you know, grow our own backyard gardens? How do we promote sustainable food agriculture practices, you know, that not only protects our land, but at the same time we're able to learn, we're able to infuse traditional knowledge into this, given that we already have existing traditional calendars of farming, agriculture calendars. So these are already, you know, existing local strategies and practices, but at the same time, we do not want to drive the attention away from countries committing to reducing their carbon emission targets. That despite our solution, that despite what we're trying to find best practices and solution, even relocation, if that's the last option to adaptation, we still have a responsibility to reducing our carbon emission, not only for the Pacific, but for the rest of the world.
Thank you, Francis. I don't think I can add a concluding line that can express things any more powerfully than you just have. And I would like to thank you and our other panelists this morning for your enormous expertise, reflections, and knowledge. I think it's been an incredibly rich discussion, and one that has set the tone very well for the rest of the conference to come. Thank you to the audience as well for your engagement, your questions, and your interest. And of course to our sponsors, Slayton & Gordon, the sponsor of our opening panel, and our premier sponsor, UNHCR. This session will be followed in just a few moments by a breakout session, which is a conversation between me and Marianne Lockery about how things have changed in this field of climate change, disasters and mobility over the last decade or so since we've been involved. It'll take place on Zoom meetings, and I invite you to join us through the link in the chat function or through the event hub that you accessed via your ticket. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at other sessions of our conference. Thank you and goodbye.